The first thing she felt was not the slap, but the silence that followed, like the whole street had stopped breathing. Then came the sting, sharp and humiliating, spreading across her face while strangers' eyes widened, some with fear, some with shame, and others with that quiet, dangerous approval that said everything about the world she lived in. He stood in front of her, tall, uniform crisp, badge gleaming under the September sun, his hand still hovering in the air, as if he hadn't quite realized what he'd done. Maybe he thought she was just another black woman who had dared to speak too loudly, dared to walk too proudly, dared to exist in a space he didn't think belonged to her. He didn't know who she was yet. He didn't know that her voice carried weight in the halls of Congress, that every word she spoke in those chambers was a fight for women who looked like her, for men who had been broken by a system that never saw them as human first. Right now, she was just another black face to him. That was the problem. Her name was Cassandra Price, 36 years old, Harvard-educated, daughter of a nurse and a postal worker. And yes, a sitting congresswoman representing her district, a woman who had walked into rooms filled with men in suits who thought she didn't belong and carved her name into the record books. But none of that mattered on this sidewalk, under this sun, with this officer's rage still hanging in the air. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. All she could think of was her grandmother's voice, the one that raised her on stories of marches and fire hoses, of bridges crossed under threat, of dignity stolen and reclaimed. Cassandra had promised her she'd never bow her head, never let them take her voice. And now, as her cheek burned, she realized this was one of those moments. The crowd shifted. Someone muttered, "That's too much." Another voice said, "She must have done something." Phones came out, lenses pointing, reality caught on shaky screens. The officer adjusted his belt, his jaw tight. "Ma'am, I asked you for identification. You refused." "That's obstruction," he said, his tone flat, rehearsed, as if reading from a script he'd written 100 times before. Cassandra finally found her voice. Low, steady, vibrating with fury she wouldn't let spill over. "You put your hands on me," she said. "For walking down the street." Her words cut through the air, louder than she expected, sharper than the slap itself. He smirked, but it was fragile, the kind of smirk that belonged to a man who thought control was his birthright. "People like you always got an excuse. People like you." That phrase, dripping with centuries of blood and chains, with laws written to keep her in the margins. The crowd reacted, a hiss, a gasp, a shifting of weight, as if the city itself recoiled. Cassandra's chest rose and fell, and in that moment, she realized this wasn't just about her. It was about every black woman who had been told to lower her eyes, every man who had been pulled over and didn't make it home, every child who learned too young that their skin was a target. But she also knew something else. The officer was seconds away from discovering that the woman he'd decided to humiliate was someone the country knew, someone whose face had been on campaign posters, whose speeches had been broadcast live, whose oath of office had been sworn under the Capitol dome. She wondered what would break first, his arrogance or his career. She didn't reach for her ID immediately. Instead, she looked straight into his eyes, forcing him to see her, not the caricature he wanted her to be. "Do you even know who I am?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake. It was iron. The crowd leaned closer. Phones tilted higher. The officer scoffed, but something flickered across his face, a tremor, a doubt he couldn't quite hide. "Doesn't matter who you are. Law's the law." Cassandra inhaled slowly, the kind of breath you take before a storm. Then she reached into her bag with deliberate calm, pulled out the leather wallet that held not just her driver's license, but her congressional ID, embossed with the seal of the United States. She held it up high enough for the cameras to see, high enough for him to see his reflection in the glass of the card. Silence again, but this time it was a silence heavy with revelation. The crowd's murmur turned electric. Someone whispered, "Oh my God, that's her. That's Representative Price." The officer's eyes darted, his mouth opening, but no words forming. The badge on his chest seemed to shrink under the weight of what he'd done. Cassandra kept her hand steady, her gaze unflinching. "I represent the people of this district," she said, "and you just assaulted me on my own street." The golden sunlight bathed her face, turning the redness of the slap into something almost radiant, like fire forged from pain. The crowd was no longer passive. They were witnesses, a jury forming in real time. Phones captured every angle. The officer swallowed hard, his authority slipping away with every second. For Cassandra, the sting on her cheek was nothing compared to the ache in her soul, the reminder that no matter how high she climbed, the world still saw her skin before her name. But maybe, just maybe, this moment could mean something more. Maybe this public humiliation could become a mirror, forcing the city, the nation, to confront itself. She straightened her shoulders, the ID still raised, her voice carrying like it did on the house floor. "You will answer for this," she said. And she meant every word. The officer's hand twitched near his radio, like a reflex, like muscle memory begging him to call for backup, but even he seemed to know that one more move could ignite something irreversible. The crowd wasn't just watching now, they were judging, recording, uploading. 1,000 screens would soon multiply into 1,000,000 eyes, and the slap he delivered, the arrogance he cloaked himself in, would no longer belong to him. It would belong to the nation. Cassandra lowered her ID slightly, not to hide it, but to show she wasn't afraid. Her heart was steady now, steadier than it had been when she was sworn in before the cameras in Washington. That was ceremony. This was battle. "Congresswoman Price," a voice broke through the thick silence. It came from somewhere in the crowd, sharp and disbelieving. Then another voice echoed it, softer, almost reverent. The officer's face shifted shades of red, anger colliding with recognition, recognition colliding with fear. His lips parted, but the words failed him. Cassandra could see the moment he realized he hadn't just slapped a black woman. He had slapped America's conscience embodied in one. Her mind raced, not with panic, but with calculation. Every move from here mattered. If she broke down, he won. If she erupted, he won. But if she stood tall, if she wielded her dignity like a blade, then maybe, just maybe, the balance would tip. She could almost hear her grandmother whispering, "Hold the line, baby. They can take everything else, but they can't take your line." The officer finally found his voice, rough and defensive. "I didn't know," he stopped himself, because the excuse was poison on his tongue. He didn't know. That was always the refrain, wasn't it? They didn't know. Didn't know the man in the hoodie was a child. Didn't know the woman in the car feared for her life. Didn't know the jogger just wanted to breathe the evening air. Ignorance used like armor, like absolution. Cassandra stepped closer, so close that the crowd hushed again. "You didn't care," she said, each word deliberate, carrying across the street. "That's worse." The officer flinched, just barely, but enough. Enough for the cameras to catch. Enough for history to record. His authority was bleeding out, and Cassandra knew it. Still, there was no satisfaction in watching him crumble. All she felt was the heavy truth pressing down on her that power had not protected her, that her title had not shielded her. Her skin had decided her fate in his eyes, and nothing else mattered until the revelation hit. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Backup was coming, the cavalry called by the same man who had struck her. Cassandra's pulse quickened. She thought of every story she had read, every hearing she had chaired, every name etched into the roll call of injustice. She would not become another headline. Not like this. She lifted her chin and spoke again, not just to him but to the crowd, to the cameras, to the invisible millions she knew would soon see. "This is why we fight," she said. "Because even standing here as your congresswoman, I'm still just another target." A murmur rippled through the bystanders. Voices overlapping now, outrage, solidarity, fear. The first police car screeched to a stop at the curb. 2 officers jumped out, their eyes darting between Cassandra, the crowd, and their colleague who now looked smaller than his uniform. They approached cautiously, reading the tension in the air like a script they didn't want to follow. Cassandra raised her ID again, clear, undeniable. "I am Representative Cassandra Price, and I have just been assaulted by your officer." The newcomers froze. One of them glanced at the cameras, his jaw tightening. This was bigger than procedure now. This was politics, scandal, history. He looked at his colleague, the man who had delivered the slap, and in that silent exchange the truth was laid bare. There was no cover for this. Not with her face, not with her name, not with the sunlight gilding every angle of the confrontation. The officer who struck her tried again, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "Congresswoman, he stopped." There was nothing left to say. Cassandra didn't answer him. She didn't need to. She turned instead to the crowd, lifting her voice like she had on campaign stages, like she had on the House floor. I want every one of you to remember this moment. Because this is not about me. It's about what happens every single day when there are no cameras, when there is no title to protect us. It's about a system that sees our skin as a crime. The crowd erupted applause, shouts, cries of agreement, the raw sound of people who had waited too long for someone to say what they lived. The golden light caught her eyes, and for a moment, Cassandra felt something greater than pain, greater than rage. She felt purpose burning through her veins. She had been humiliated, but she would turn that humiliation into fire. The senior of the two new officers stepped forward, clearing his throat. Congresswoman Price, we will file an immediate report. This will go straight to internal affairs. His words were stiff, official, but his eyes betrayed unease. Cassandra held his gaze. It will go further than that, she said. It will go to the people, because they deserve to know. And just like that, the scene shifted. What had started as violence became testimony. What had begun as silence became a chorus. The officer who struck her stood motionless, cornered not by law but by truth. He had thought he was disciplining a stranger. Instead, he had exposed a wound that ran through the entire nation. As Cassandra walked away, surrounded now by people who wanted to shield her, her cheeks still burning, she knew the fight ahead would be brutal. The news vans would swarm. The pundits would dissect her tone, her words, her expression. They would ask if she provoked him, if she escalated. They always did. But none of that mattered compared to what she had already seen in the crowd's eyes. Hope. Anger. Solidarity. A spark. She thought back to her first campaign speech, the one she gave on a borrowed microphone in a church basement. She had told them she was running because too many of their stories went unheard. Today, her own story had been written on her skin. And though it broke her heart, she understood the weight of it. Sometimes change came not from the victories you chose, but from the battles that chose you. That night, as the city buzzed with the story, Cassandra sat alone in her apartment, the glow of the television reflecting her own face back at her. Headlines scrolled across the screen. Congresswoman Price assaulted by police. Videos replayed endlessly, the slaps slowed down, dissected, debated. She turned the sound off. She didn't need their voices. She remembered every sound from the street, the hush, the gasp, the rising tide of voices that had carried her through. Her phone buzzed constantly, colleagues, journalists, constituents. Messages of outrage, support, strategy. But one call she couldn't ignore, her grandmother. The old woman's voice crackled with age but burned with fire. Baby, I saw it. I saw what he did. And I saw you stand tall. Cassandra closed her eyes, her throat tightening. I felt like I was back on that bridge, her grandmother continued. But this time, you were the one holding the line. Tears pricked Cassandra's eyes, but she let them fall. Not out of weakness, but out of the deep, aching truth that her fight was not new. It was inherited, and it would not end with her. Tomorrow, she would face cameras, hearings, a nation split between denial and awakening. Tomorrow, the officer would face consequences he never imagined when he raised his hand. But tonight, under the soft golden glow of her lamp, Cassandra let herself feel everything: the pain, the pride, the fear, the fire. She touched her cheek, still tender, and whispered to herself, "They will never silence me." And she meant it. Morning came with no mercy. The sun spilled across the city in streaks of gold, as if mocking the chaos that had bloomed overnight. Cassandra woke to the sound of pounding at her door, not fists but cameras, journalists already swarming her apartment building. The slap had gone viral. Millions of views, thousands of hashtags, a tidal wave of outrage and denial crashing across the country. Some headlines called her a victim, others accused her of grandstanding. And already, in the darker corners of the internet, she saw the usual chorus. She must have deserved it. She should have complied. Another black woman making trouble. Cassandra knew this script too well, and yet it still pierced. She stood in the bathroom, staring at her reflection. The faint outline of the officer's hand lingered across her cheek, a bruise blossoming like an unwanted tattoo. She touched it gently, not out of vanity, but out of disbelief. Power, titles, education, none of it had shielded her. She was stripped down to the rawest truth. Her skin had decided her fate long before her words had. She leaned over the sink, whispering to herself, "You can't let this break you." By noon, She was standing in front of a bank of microphones, a wall of reporters pressed against barricades, their voices rising in a chaotic chorus. She held her head high, the bruise visible, her voice steady. What happened yesterday was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something deeper, something that poisons our streets and our souls. I am a congresswoman, yes. But before that, I am a black woman in America. And if this can happen to me, with cameras watching, imagine what happens to those without a title, without a crowd, without a lens to capture the truth. Flashes exploded around her. A reporter shouted, "Do you want the officer fired?" Cassandra didn't flinch. "I want accountability. For him, yes, but also for the system that made him believe my skin was justification for violence. This is not about one man. This is about a culture that allows brutality to masquerade as law." Another voice cut in, sharper, accusatory. "Were you disrespectful to the officer before the incident? Did you provoke him?" Cassandra's chest tightened, but her grandmother's words steadied her. "Hold the line. No one provokes a slap," she answered firmly. "Violence is never justified by volume, by tone, or by identity. Violence is a choice." And yesterday, he chose. The crowd erupted, some clapping, some shouting follow-ups, the chaos of truth colliding with denial. Cassandra stepped back, her staff ushering her inside the building where a hearing had been scheduled. The House Oversight Committee wanted her statement. Cameras weren't allowed in the room, but she knew her words would carry beyond these walls. Inside, the air was thick with formality and tension. Rows of men and women in suits sat before her, some allies, some skeptics, some political opportunists already calculating how to spin this moment. Cassandra sat at the table, the microphone angled toward her, the bruise on her cheek unavoidable even under the sterile lights. She took a breath and began. What happened on that street was not about me alone. It was about a system of assumptions. When that officer saw me, he didn't see a congresswoman. He didn't see an American exercising her rights. He saw a threat. My skin was his evidence. My existence was his crime. Some members shifted uncomfortably, others scribbled notes, others watched with open sympathy. Cassandra continued, her voice rising with each sentence. "We are told again and again that these are isolated incidents. That training will fix it. That more rules will solve it. But what we refuse to confront is the root, the prejudice ingrained in institutions meant to serve and protect. If my title couldn't protect me, what chance does a teenager walking home have? What chance does a father pulled over for a broken taillight have?" Silence followed her words, heavy and suffocating. One congressman cleared his throat, his tone dripping skepticism. "Representative Price, are you suggesting that law enforcement as a whole is racist?" Cassandra didn't flinch. "I am saying that racism is embedded in its foundation. And until we admit that, until we rip out the roots instead of trimming the branches, we will keep burying names. Names of our sons, our daughters, our neighbors." The room shifted. She could feel it. Some would leave hardened against her, others ignited. But no one could leave untouched. Her testimony was not just fact. It was flesh and blood, written across her face. When the hearing ended, Cassandra stepped into a hallway already buzzing with whispers. Her aide pressed a phone into her hand. "It's everywhere," the young woman said breathlessly. "They're replaying your speech, your press conference. It's trending globally. People are marching tonight in your district and beyond." Cassandra's chest tightened. Marches meant power, but also risk. She remembered Ferguson, Minneapolis, countless cities where peaceful protest had met tear gas. But she also remembered her grandmother's story, Selma, Montgomery, Washington. The march was not just reaction, it was legacy. That evening, Cassandra stood on the steps of City Hall, the crowd sprawling before her like a living ocean, signs raised, chants rising into the night sky. The bruise on her cheek glowed under the streetlights, not as shame, but as testament. She raised her fist, not in anger, but in solidarity. "We are not here tonight just because I was struck," she shouted into the microphone, the crowd roaring back. "We are here because every slap, every chokehold, every bullet is an attack on our shared humanity. And we are here to say enough." The crowd thundered, their voices echoing off buildings, rattling the city's bones. Cassandra felt the surge of energy, a force bigger than any law, any chamber, any headline. It was the people. It was the pulse of justice demanding to be heard. And yet, Even in that triumphant roar, Cassandra knew the battle was far from over. The officer had been suspended, yes, but suspension was not accountability. There would be hearings, investigations, lawsuits, and there would be backlash, the talk shows questioning her motives, the politicians framing her as a radical, the endless cycle of distortion. But she was ready, because she understood now more than ever that this fight wasn't about her survival. It was about transformation. Later that night, back in her apartment, Cassandra scrolled through videos of the march, tears slipping silently down her face. She saw children chanting her name, elders lifting signs, strangers hugging in the streets. She saw a city awakened, even if just for a moment. She whispered to the empty room, "Let this not fade. Let this grow." Her phone buzzed again. A message from a young man she didn't know, sent through her office. It read, "I was going to quit law school. Watching you yesterday made me stay. We need people like you. Thank you." Cassandra pressed the phone to her chest, her tears falling freely now. This was the cost of visibility, the weight of leadership. To take the slap, not just for yourself, but for the millions who couldn't afford to fall. She looked at her cheek in the mirror again, the bruise darker now, but she didn't see weakness. She saw proof. Proof that the struggle was real, that the fight was necessary, that the line her grandmother spoke of still needed holding. And she promised herself, whispered into the golden-lit silence of her room, "They may strike us, but we will rise louder than the blow." Tomorrow would bring more questions, more battles, more fire. But tonight, Cassandra allowed herself one fragile truth. Pain had not broken her. It had carved her into something sharper, something unstoppable. Weeks turned into months, and the bruise on Cassandra's face faded, but the memory never did. The slap had become more than an act of violence. It was now a symbol etched into the nation's conscience. The video played on news cycles, in classrooms, at protests across the country. Her name, once known only within the walls of Congress and her district, now carried across the globe. But with recognition came weight, and Cassandra bore it every day like an armor she hadn't chosen but refused to take off. The officer who struck her, Daniel Mercer, faced his hearing. The courtroom was packed, not just with legal observers, but with ordinary people who wanted to see justice, who wanted proof that accountability wasn't a myth. Cassandra sat in the front row, her face calm, but her hands tight in her lap. Mercer walked in, his uniform replaced by a suit that looked borrowed, his arrogance gone, replaced by something quieter: fear. The prosecutor's opening statement was sharp, clear. This case is not about one slap. It is about a system that emboldened a man with a badge to act not as protector, but as oppressor. It is about the belief that some lives are worth less, that some faces are threats before they even speak. That belief struck Representative Price on a public street. And that belief must be confronted here, in this courtroom. Mercer's defense lawyer countered with the same tired refrain. "My client acted under stress. He did not know she was a member of Congress. He was following protocol." Cassandra felt her jaw tighten. Protocol. That word had buried too many lives. She thought of mothers who buried sons, fathers who buried daughters, families who buried futures, all under the banner of protocol. When it was her turn to testify, Cassandra rose slowly, each step toward the witness stand echoing in the silent room. She placed her hand on the Bible, took the oath, and looked directly at the jury. Her voice was steady, not trembling, not fiery, just true. "When he struck me, he didn't ask my name. He didn't ask my story. He didn't ask my rights. He decided, in that moment, that I was less than him. Not because of what I did, but because of who I am. Because of what I look like. And that is not just his failure. That is the failure of a system that allowed him to believe violence was his language of choice." Her words hung in the air, heavier than any gavel. Some jurors looked down, others looked at her with tears in their eyes. Mercer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor. For once, he couldn't smirk, couldn't dismiss. He was stripped bare before truth. The trial lasted weeks. Experts testified about racial bias in policing, statistics about disproportionate stops, evidence of complaints against Mercer that had gone ignored. Each revelation was another stone added to the mountain of injustice that Cassandra had sworn to expose. And when the jury finally returned, the air in the room was suffocating with anticipation. The foreman stood, hands trembling, voice cracking. "We find the defendant guilty." The room erupted, some in cheers, some in cries of relief, some in stunned silence. Cassandra closed her eyes, a single tear escaping. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't vengeance. It was something deeper. A crack in the wall, a light through the fracture. Mercer was led away, his career shattered, his arrogance replaced by the reality of consequences. But Cassandra knew this was not the end. One man's conviction did not dismantle a system. One guilty verdict did not heal centuries of pain. But it was something. And sometimes something was enough to start. Outside the courthouse, the crowd gathered again, their voices rising in chants that filled the air with defiance and hope. Cassandra stepped up to the microphones, her heart pounding not from fear, but from conviction. Justice is not a moment, she told them. It is a movement. This verdict is not the end. It is the beginning. We will not stop until every person is safe in their own skin, until every life is valued equally, until no one fears the very people meant to protect them. This is our country, and we are claiming it, together. The crowd roared, the golden sunlight breaking through the clouds as if the heavens themselves were listening. Cassandra felt the warmth on her face, not the sting of a slap, but the embrace of something greater: solidarity, resilience, truth. In the months that followed, Cassandra became more than a congresswoman. She became a symbol. Legislation was introduced in her name: bills to increase accountability, to overhaul training, to demand transparency. The fight was fierce, with opposition clawing at every step, but Cassandra refused to bend. She stood on the House floor, her speeches echoing with the power of lived truth, her cheek healed but the memory of the bruise forever present. She received letters from across the country. A mother in Alabama thanking her for giving her son hope. A police officer in Oregon apologizing for what the badge had come to represent. A teenager in New York saying she wanted to run for office because Cassandra showed her it was possible. Each letter was a reminder. Pain could be transformed into purpose, violence into vision. One night, months after the verdict, Cassandra visited her grandmother's house. The old woman sat on the porch, rocking gently, the summer air thick with cicadas. Cassandra sat beside her, resting her head on her grandmother's shoulder like she had as a child. "You did it, baby," her grandmother whispered. Cassandra shook her head softly. "No, Grandma. We did it. You walked so I could run, and I ran so others could fly. It's all of us." Her grandmother smiled, her eyes glistening. "And don't you forget, baby, they can try to strike you down, but they'll never silence the truth." Cassandra closed her eyes, the golden glow of the porch light wrapping around them. For the first time in months, she let herself breathe, let herself rest, knowing the fight would continue tomorrow. But tonight, she had held the line. The slap that was meant to break her had instead awakened a movement. And in the end, that was the officer's greatest mistake. He thought he was silencing a woman. Instead, he had given voice to a nation. And so, Cassandra Price walked forward not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a torchbearer. The golden light followed her, not from the sun, not from the cameras, but from within. A fire that could not be slapped out, a truth that could not be denied. The nation would remember the slap, yes. But more than that, it would remember what came after: the rising, the reckoning, the promise of something better. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.